Please welcome Karen Finney, Kevin Madden, Bruce Reed, and Jim Shelton.
All right. How's everybody doing? Oh, yeah, the break was good. Okay. I have never been in a room with social sculptors. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jim Shelton. I used to work in government. I'm here with folks who actually have played pretty significant roles with folks who are running for president, have run for president, have been vice president, to talk about the issue of the day, economic mobility, and how it shows up in these races. Now, the interesting thing for today is that two things are top of mind. One is the American dream, as you'll hear from Raj Chetty, is disappearing. Like, that's not a euphemism, that's a fact. We used to have, at the end of the 1940s, 90% of Americans could count on doing better than their parents economically. That is down at least to the 50s and the 80s. And there's no reason to believe that it stopped there. The second thing that's on people's mind is, and I don't know if they frame it this way, but inequality that comes with that. And the thing that we need to remember about inequality is it also compounds, right? Everybody remember when you first learned about retirement savings and everybody said, you know, the earlier you start, the better off you are? Well, if somebody started 2 or 3 generations before you did, how exactly do you catch up? So the tensions that our country feels are very real. After the last recession, 50% of the jobs were created in less than 3% of the counties. So those parts of the countries that feel like opportunity is happening for somewhere else, it actually is. And RFA did a poll that said, hey, do you trust our folks that are making decisions to use evidence to make their decision making? 8% said that they did. 8% of Americans said that they believed that their policymakers actually use evidence to make decisions. 34% said 40% said they thought that lobbyists drove their decisions. Think about that and what it means for our institutions. So economic mobility is at the top of the list of important issues. It ought to be a core conversation in terms of our politics. People don't believe that we're using evidence. Results for America released this playbook today. Oh, sorry, I'm supposed to do this. 17 ideas that could be infused into presidential campaigns. So we'll hear today from Karen, Kevin, and Bruce about how evidence is and isn't showing up in these conversations, how we are thinking about mobility. And with that, I wanted to stop talking and just let us jump into the conversation. You'll know we'll go for about 25 minutes, and then you're going to have a chance to get your questions out. If you don't have questions, I will cold call. So I kind of gave kind of a dire setup.
Yeah, it's going to be real hard to come in as the optimist now.
Yeah, well, you know. But the reality is that this conversation around mobility has kind of fallen to the back behind what I'll call big ideas, right? There's like free college for all, Medicaid for all. These things seem really expensive in a lot of different ways. There is this conversation about, like, so how do we begin a conversation that's really tied to day-to-day improvement in economic mobility and how these big ideas either fit in or don't when you're trying to make progress?
Well,
Any of you can jump in.
I'll start because I think it's at the heart of a lot of times what we do wrong in Washington, and that's why I'm really happy with the contents of the playbook right now, and I think how it will help shape the folks that are running for the presidency as they think about this, because we get very caught up in sort of we get very caught up in thinking about like the big partisan battles in Washington, D.C., and economic mobility and the way to win that argument and build broader coalitions behind it so that they recognize it and believe it's a big policy priority is to personalize it and localize it. oftentimes you'll see people talk about, they use the data and talk about, poll results, which 80% of Americans think this or 80% of Americans think that. When what we have to remember is that there are people that are experiencing the impacts of policymaking in their day-to-day lives, whether that is their efforts to get a job, get better wages, get affordable health care, quality education. And one of the things that the playbook does, and the Results for America approach does very well, is it sort of brings to life how all of this is having a measurable impact on the day-to-day lives of people. And I think one of the things, too, that Results for America has done very well in the last couple of years is they put a particular emphasis on engaging local officials, where they are, they don't have the luxury of having partisan debates in 30-second sound bites and on CNN or Fox News every single day here in Washington as part of this partisan viper pit. Instead, and this was something that was hammered into me as part of my work with Results for America, I went out to Iowa and worked with the Iowa Conference of Mayors, and I remember bringing this question up, and they said, we don't have time for that. We have sewer systems to build, we have schools to fund, we have budgets to balance. And that is at the heart, I think, of how this evidence-based policymaking can really make an impact. And I think as we engage folks that are running for president, running for Senate, running for House, that is a really powerful lesson to apply when we're working with them.
So I hear you on that, and at the same time, I'm recognizing that these big ideas seem to be captivating the day, and I'm not clear that the kind of bumping and grinding that it takes to get the infrastructure for an evidence-based program in place actually is getting on people's minds and getting in the conversation. Karen, I'll skip you for a second and jump to Bruce. Bruce, are you seeing any of these ideas that seem evidence-based that are in the conversation today?
Well, look, I'm not sure we have any evidence superheroes out there on the hustings, but I will tell you the thing that makes me optimistic is that I spend almost all my time in the heartland. I travel around the country with Joe Biden. In fact, I just took a red eye from Reno. I started the day in Vegas, went to Reno, came to Results for America. If you really want to see a show, come to RFA. But voters have their feet very solidly on the ground, and they know we have big problems, but they also recognize, as you said, that we have little trust, and we have to figure out some way to rebuild that too. So they want to hear ambitious goals, but they also get most excited when you show them how you could actually get something done. Because we don't think about it so much here in Washington, but for everyone else who's watching Washington, for most of the last 20 years, you really haven't seen much except bickering, and every now and then something great happens, and then we keep fighting over it. So this, I think, the two of the most surprising things I found are first that people are more open to evidence, argument, and wonky details than you think. Yesterday I was at a gun forum in Vegas where all the candidates were there, and like every other speaker was talking about evidence-based this or that. My boss talked about evidence-based gun violence interventions and evidence-based lethality assessments for potential victims of domestic violence, and the audience was like, "Give us more of that."
No. I mean, Results for America poll says 86% of folks said, we wish people would use the evidence.
That's the policy guy's dream.
Well, it's a scary thought to think that anybody's reading this stuff. But this should warm the hearts of every RFAer and Hamilton Project person and alumnus of the Treasury or OMB. One of the biggest responses that the Vice President gets when he talks about healthcare is when he cites an Urban Institute idea about auto enrollment in Medicaid for people who are eligible but live in red states and can't get it now. And, you know, we sit here thinking, well, infrastructure is 4 syllables. How are we ever going to sell that? Auto enrollment, 5 syllables, and people get it right away. And the other thing that they really respond to, which is heartening and surprising, is even if you go to a partisan Democratic audience in a purple or blue state, when you talk about what we really need to do is find a way to work together and get things done, that strips away all the politics from it, and people stand and cheer.
In rooms outside of RFA. Go ahead, Karen.
I think people believe that, but I think part of what we've seen is that increasingly, right, our people's lived experience is not matching the statistics that we're throwing at them out of Washington, right? Like my favorite, Trump talks about lowest African-American unemployment ever. Just came out of South Carolina with 4 focus groups. We didn't even ask people, and somebody brought that up and said, yeah, it's low, but I have 2 jobs, and I can't afford my kids' school. I can't afford my prescription drugs. So yes, that's a great statistic, but that statistic is not what's really happening in that person's life. And so I think part of it, and I think part of why people like when you talk about, what was that again, the thing?
Auto enrollment.
Auto enrollment. A lot of times also the conversations we tend to have are the big lofty ideas. Like a lot of people that I talk to, again, in focus groups say, well, so how does Medicaid for All work? What's going to happen? Am I going to have a card? Can I see my doctor? They don't care as much about, the anxiety they have about Obamacare or 10-year phase-in or not is how will it affect me and my kids and my life? And we tend to talk in these big generalities, and these numbers don't mean anything, right? And so I think part of why evidence-based is so important is it brings it down to a level where people can say, okay, I can see that. And I will tell you, the toughest group is Black women. They want the details. How are you going to pay for that? How many people? How long is that going to take? I mean, it is stunning to me. Every focus group I've ever done with Black women, they want the details, right? And I think I want to say that, I think there's a racial divide here in that in the Black community, a lot of people, when we talk about disparities, honestly, and they'll say, yeah, it sucks. It sucked, and it's going to keep sucking. It was a little bit better when Obama was president because at least we had a little bit of hope because we had a Black guy. It was a little bit better when Bill Clinton was president because we had a little more money in our pocket. But so when we think about how the divides are increasing, part of the problem is that, people who are on the bottom are feeling like there's all these conversations up here happening, but nobody's really speaking to an idea that that they can see and how it would fit into their lives and how it would change their lives. And I do think the more we talk about programs or policies and ideas, again, where people can see, it's like when Elizabeth Warren talks about the wealth tax, right? 2 cents on every dollar over 50 million. That's okay, I can understand that, right? And then you've got all this money to pay for all these things. That makes sense to people. I'll give you another example. I think one of the reasons, Pete Buttigieg got in a little bit of trouble when, he talked about his relationship with the African American community after the shooting. He did a bunch of interviews and talked about, how one of the realities is that African American, the number of police officers had declined also under his tenure. And I don't mean to just beat up on Pete, it's just, I think, a really important example. And so he did this one interview, and he was talking about, all these things they've done. They changed the website and the portal, and they're trying to make it more user-friendly, and it's best practices and all this research that they did. And, so my colleague Don Lemon was like, okay, but you still have fewer African-American police officers than you did when you started. So that sounds great, but it's not working. It's not offering results, and the community doesn't feel it, and they don't see it. And so I think that's one of the most important things is making that connection back with people.
So I actually hear you guys saying a lot of the same thing, but in slightly different ways about how do you actually make this stuff land for people in a way that they can actually understand how it's going to impact their daily lives. Mm-hmm. You gave a couple of great examples, Karen. Kevin, are you seeing anybody out there who is doing a really great job of using data or evidence to support in a way that actually connects with people and what their concerns are?
Yeah, and if everybody gets a chance to look at the playbook, it's a very comprehensive assessment, and provides, like, that's one of the things that's interesting, is that a lot of times groups like Results for America will go into a meeting and with a a potential candidate or somebody, a lawmaker up on Capitol Hill, and they'll say, yeah, you should adopt our program, and they talk about it in almost conceptual terms to a point where it doesn't really have an impact. But if you look at the playbook, like, there are links in there that bring us to RFA partners and specific mentions of cities about what they're doing to implement evidence-based policy making that's having a direct impact on budgets, that's having a direct impact on lives. So the What Works Cities portion of the playbook is a perfect example that just brings to life all of these different issues. Everything from early childhood education to infrastructure, you name it. They are providing the details. They're literally handing policymakers a roadmap of best practices, and that is it. That's a really important way to advocate for policies like this and their implementation.
Add one thing
Please.
to that, which I think is really important, which is I'm actually a little bit surprised that we haven't heard more candidates talking about, here's what's working locally. We need to try to scale that up nationally, because that's where we don't need to be reinventing the wheel necessarily, right? We need to be finding where the good ideas are. And with what Kevin said about mayors is right, because by the way, if you get it wrong, and when you're in the grocery store with your kids, somebody's going to come up to you and say, you totally screwed up. That program didn't work, right? So the rubber really meets the road for mayors. But I would like to see in this presidential cycle more sort of bringing to that's what's so great about the playbook, right? It's bringing these ideas and saying, look, there are places where these things have worked. We can scale them up in some areas, maybe not in all. It's not one size fits all, but I would love to see the policy conversation be sort of filled with more of what are the good ideas, because there's been a lot of innovation, I think, happening in cities and states, particularly in part because people are like, well, we can't wait for the federal government to get their act together. We're going to have to just do it.
So let me ask the question then, because Bruce, you gave some great examples about how Vice President Biden is actually using these kind of examples when he's out in the field. But when we get to the big stage, I'm actually not hearing those kind of examples hit the conversation the way Karen just described. Why are they not actually following things like the kind of examples that are in the playbook? Why are they not, if in fact people think evidence is important, citing the evidence on the big stage? What would you tell them to do in order to begin to incorporate those things into their campaigns in a way that would give us confidence that they're going to be able to do something besides talk at 100,000 feet and not deliver the big legislation?
Well, I'd say a couple things. First is it's a very crowded big stage. And, 24 candidates, most of them really interested in policy. Like Jay Inslee wrote a 5-volume climate change plan, which is fantastic.
You read it?
I read it. Elizabeth Warren, who has a plan on everything, said, what he said. So there's a lot of people with a lot to say, and they get a minute and a half in the debates to do it. But I think the other thing that Democrats are dealing with is, let's face it, Donald Trump has been a shock to the system. I like to say anybody can invent a driverless car. It took America to build a driverless country. But he has triggered two competing impulses in the Democratic mind. On the one hand, you look at Trump and you think, oh, well, maybe the laws of gravity don't apply. Maybe you don't have to do math. Maybe you can get away with anything. Maybe our goal should be to, kind of stretch the imagination or broaden the Overton window, as Warren and Sanders like to say. Push the envelope and change the rules. Get rid of the filibuster. A whole bunch of things that are a natural reaction to Trump, I suppose, but take you away from persuasion, evidence, winning the argument. But I think the other opportunity that Trump has presented for people who care about gravity is that it's also left this huge vacuum where there's an actual hunger for specifics, for somebody to make a case. people get really excited when you say things like, we believe in truth over lies and science over fiction. I just think there's a hunger for evidence-based policy, not Sharpie-based policy.
And can I just make
Please
a point
do,
on
yeah.
that? Because it's a good one. And what Trump also exposed sort of, I think, inside the system is that there is not this rigid ideology that drives voters the way a lot of people have a simplistic analysis of voters. So you'll oftentimes you would see before Trump, they're like, oh, we can't do that because Tea Party type Republicans are only going to care about spending and they're going to be no against this, or they're going to be no because it seems to grow government. And what Trump sort of exposes is that they're much more transactional and it's a lot less rigid as far as ideology. And so what you're seeing, and this is something that in the book, Moneyball for Government, Howard Wolfson and I sort of dedicate a chapter to, which is if you can focus on engaging both Republicans and Democrats on impact, and then personalizing and localizing how that impact is beneficial, you'll start to see these old sort of applications of, well, we can't engage the left because they have this sort of ideology, and we can't engage the right because they have this ideology. And I think it helps advocates like those of us in this room to be much more creative and much more entrepreneurial with how we build the coalitions of support that we need to advance evidence-based policies.
So two quick things on that. One, do you think in this, and you're looking at it from the Republican side, but looking at the Democratic race, do you think that there's open space for someone to really talk about bipartisan partnership to get work done in the country?
Not until you get past, I'd say, South Carolina, and you have enough votes to secure the nomination. Like I would, Bruce is right in a lot of his assessments, but I would say the biggest problem right now I have watching this Democrat field is like, and first of all, I'm not a pro-Trump Republican. I did not vote for Trump. I've never been more gettable by a Democrat nominee, but yet I don't feel like they're talking to me. They are talking to a very vocal minority in their base. But that's the thing is, I want to see if they, to a certain point, they pivot and they're thinking like, okay, disaffected Republicans who, if you took just the 50 states, there's only like 10 to 15% of them. But if you draw a 25-mile radius around places like Milwaukee and Columbus, Ohio, and Philadelphia, Maricopa County, all these big swing areas of states that they need to win, are they going to be able to go out there and say to a guy like me, a voter like me, this is a different type of Democrat who is not looking to have a confrontational clash with me on policy, but instead wants to persuade me? That Democrat could very well defeat President Trump. And if Trump, I think, starts to look beyond his base, which is really like, I wouldn't put money on it if I had a lot of it in Vegas, but if he were to do that and recognize that the key to his reelection is that same 25-mile radius around a lot of these suburban centers where there are a greater concentration of swing voters who think like this and they want a different type of Republican or a different type of Democrat, that I think is going to be, I'd like to see that conversation inside presidential 2020 strategy rooms.
Got it. You guys can respond to that too if you want, but I wanted to just come back to this point, Bruce, that you made that on a large stage like that, people don't really have time to do this, but it seems like on a large stage like that, finding a way to differentiate yourself from the group might be a smart strategy, and everyone is talking in platitudes right now. And so now that people have the playbook, and there are examples, and there are things that they can talk about that they could do that are really concrete, what do you think the odds are that it starts to show up sooner versus later?
Well, there's some great ideas in the playbook. I'll talk about those. I think, some of the candidates haven't taken off, but have really interesting things to say. I'd say all the governors in the race have been very concrete, and they have a record to show for it, and they talk about what worked in their state, and it's impressive, and it's a shame they don't get more airtime or more of a chance to shine. And I think somebody who has kind of punched above his weight by talking this way is Andrew Yang, who's got a very strange following, the Yang Gang. But they are passionate, and he's got 90 policy proposals on his website. Like his supporters wear signs, wear hats that say math on the front. That's one of his biggest applause lines. Sometimes the hats are math on the front and a marijuana leaf on the back, but he's a great candidate, raising interesting ideas, which is the great opportunity. The one thing you can do in a presidential campaign that you can't do any other time is inject new ideas into the bloodstream. They don't have to be, massive, earth-shattering. They could just be new. And some of the ones in the playbook that I really like, there's a number 7 talks about the need to promote science and research and singles out DARPA. Actually, there's sort of a space race among the Democratic candidates to see who can have the most things that are modeled after DARPA. I think we're winning, Biden campaign. We have ARPA. Well, there's already an ARPA-E that was created in 2009, but we have an ARPA-A for agriculture, ARPA-C for climate, and most important, ARPA-H for health research. It's funny because you think,
I'll forgive you for not saying ARPA-Ed.
well, we have a disagreement with the Trump administration, which wants to call ARPA-H HARPA, and it means something completely different, apparently. But the funny thing is that, you can't sell an idea like ARPA-H without a fair amount of explanation. But people love it. They actually think that's what government should do. It's logical things, go find solutions, use tax dollars wisely in ways that get big results and that can help the whole economy grow.
So Karen, I want you to tell us whether you think we have any chance of seeing this stuff start to show up in a really significant way now that people have a playbook to follow. And then I'd love for us to take an optimistic view and say, somebody gets in. Gets in? Another person gets in the White House.
Oh, in the White House. I'm sorry. I thought you meant in the race.
No.
Jesus.
Another person. Jesus, no. Sorry.
We just got 10 of them.
Another person. Somebody actually wins the White House.
Right.
And wants to actually make a run at really pursuing the plays in the playbook. What's the most important stuff to get done in the first 100 days? And I'll come to you other two after that, and then I'll come to the audience for questions.
So here's what I think the challenge in 2020 is. Because I think Trump represents such an existential, immediate threat to people. To women, people of color. It's interesting, just as a sidebar, every focus group I do with Black and brown people is the first thing that comes up. They're experiencing their whole life through race, and so it's really because they feel the society is so much more racialized. So it's harder to have a policy conversation because this is how they're seeing it. So I think part of just the dynamic on this side is head versus heart, where we love elections because it's about ideas, and it's great to hear the different candidates talk about their big ideas and things that we could do, and maybe some of it sounds a little, free college, for example, in 2016. I thought that was probably not realistic, but that's fun. Let's talk about that, right? So I think, but on the other hand, people are so focused on how to beat Trump. And I think that's part of why also people are moving kind of quickly to try to whittle the field down, because I think people felt like 20 is too many. Let's get to a number that feels manageable. Let's see what their ideas are, and if we think we can win. And one of the things in our CNN poll we just did was we actually tested different ideas, and so Medicare for All, one of the things, it's 60% of people, they like it, but they don't think it can win in a general election. So I think one of the things that is really powerful in the playbook is these are ideas that if they've already been tested and they're working. So entering that into a conversation gives you an opportunity to both hit the head and the heart, because you can offer something that maybe we haven't been talking about, but you think can actually win. And so that's, I think, the duality of the cycle right now. Personally, I think the most important thing, there's so many important things, if we get somebody in the White House and you talk about this, I think it's having somebody who says, I'm gonna make this idea of evidence-based results and trying new things a priority. And I know you talk about establishing an actual department in the White House and have people really focused on that. I think that would be a fantastic idea. But I think it would be really important that there are quick wins because, it's like the Giuliani thing when he became mayor and he got rid of the squeegee guys. Immediately, New Yorkers felt like something changed. It was a small thing, but it was something. So I think whatever it is.
He's moved on.
I know. He's moved on to Crazy Town, obviously. So,
Interesting example.
He's actually talking to the squeegee. I don't know it. I'm kidding. All love to squeegee people.
Good deal.
But I think that's the thing, right? Is that people are going to need
Leadership and quick wins.
to feel like something's changing quickly.
Got it. Either one of you guys.
Well, I'd say RFA has always been great about setting actionable goals. So I think it's important to aim high, but not kid ourselves. As Karen said, Donald Trump will define this race one way or another, both in the primaries and in the general. He's a guy whose attitude is there is no evidence and it's not discoverable. And I think we're not going to be able to have the most satisfying logical conversation with that guy. But the core principles that drive everything that RFA does, the sort of basic common sense that crosses party lines no matter who's president, that if you propose something, you should show a way to pay for it. If you have an idea, you should show where it works, and you should promise that you're going to measure whether it works, and you're going to stop doing it if it doesn't work. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point where audiences are chanting the 1% proposal for evaluation. It could be 1 cent, 1 cent, 1 cent. But I guarantee you that the voters that Kevin was talking about, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for they will put party aside if someone sensible comes along.
Good deal.
I'll be real quick because I
Please,
know
yeah,
more
we
time.
have
But
questions.
I would say on the evidence-based policymaking, what I think would be really important is if somebody new came in and they used the evidence to inform a courage to cut. Because I think where you want to promote stuff that works, you also want to use it, and I think that would sort of re-scramble the idea of what people think as typical Democrat bureaucrats are, which is like they just want more money, they just want bigger government. Using evidence to say this one's going to go, so we can shift the resources to this, what works. That would be huge. And then lastly, just big picture, I just want somebody who's optimistic. We are in this dreadful hangover of pessimism and bickering. And I want somebody who's going to elevate a conversation and be very optimistic about what we can achieve with Republicans, Democrats, and independents moving forward.
Awesome. Questions? There are 3 mic runners who are supposed to be here in the room. Who wants to raise their hand first? Here, sir. Can you get a mic? Thanks.
David Maloney, Fuse Corps. My question is, can you speak to the breakdown in the federal and local relationship? None of the major issues, if you think about it, cities are the platform for change in America now, whether it's marijuana policy, whether it's marriage equality, whether it's housing, but you can't divorce some of that from the requirement that there be a partnership between local, state, and federal government, and that seems to get lost. And even take something like opportunity zones, that's still large in some ways. The rulemaking hasn't been finalized on that. So can you speak to a little bit about how do we get to a point where there are people working at all levels kind of together on the same types of issues, because you can't unscramble these and say cities.
Yeah, you're scratching my itch as a Republican, which is that the more limited government and push the resources down at the local level, where local control and local impact can be better managed. And this was something that, as I spent time traveling and working with local officials, trying to get them to buy onto the what works agenda, that was something that they constantly fed back. Republicans, Democrats said, what do you need the federal government to do? Quite frankly, we need them to get out of the way. Or when they're looking at resources, push them down to the level where they can have an impact. So, I started out in city government, and it was one of the most important lessons I learned when I was working for the mayor in my hometown, Yonkers, New York. He said, there's no Republican or Democrat way to pick up the garbage and to plow the streets. He's like, it either gets done or it doesn't, and I got a bunch of phone calls. I got a bunch of phones ringing in this office. So that is a really important part of it. And I think de-emphasizing this romanticization, I guess, of federal government. Like everybody calls this higher office. Like, why? Like, people that are making the impact every single day, and the mayor, right? Mayors and city, like, higher office. Like, right? If I was a mayor, I'd be like, get over yourselves, right? Like, you're not doing anything. You guys are talking. You guys are having motions to recommit. You're having long committee hearings. Like, I am actually running a city where people's lives are affected every day.
Good deal. Anybody else want to get in on that one?
I only have something negative to say, so I won't say it.
Okay. So next person, raise your hand. What I want to say is the opportunity to incentivize states through these federal programs to put in place the evidence-based infrastructure is something that the federal government could do that could actually drive things up and down. But, you know, states get to opt in. I'm not clear exactly how states opt up in that process. All right. Who's got the next question? Back here.
Bethany Little Education Council. I have a question that's going to take a second to frame. I'm struck by Karen's point about all the black and brown focus groups feeling like everybody's seeing their life through race. My limited understanding is that most people who are black and brown in this country have to always see their life through race, and it's just Trump making white people acknowledge and see that too. And I wonder, though, policy is also racialized and often racist, and evidence is also racialized and often racist. And I wonder, as we bake evidence building and evidence use into government more and more together, working on that, how do we bake racial justice also into the way we expect evidence to be built? Who gets funded to collect evidence? Who are they studying? Who is it for? How do we deal with that?
Bethany Little, go ahead.
Don't you want to take that? I'm kidding. Look, I think a couple of things, right? I think, one of the things that folks have said that I think is really important with a lot of these ideas is we want to see you in the community doing it. We want to be able to see it. So don't just tell us your plan, tell us how you're going to do it, but then we want to be able to see in our daily life that it's happening. So I think that's one thing, because that makes people feel more trust. And I think, but also I think as we're thinking about designing research studies, when we're thinking about who are the people who are going into communities to do that work, do they look like the people that they're going to work with? Are we taking into account inherent, implicit racial bias and sexism and gender biases? I think that's a whole other way to be thinking about this, and I just don't. Some do it well, some don't, but I think that's a really important piece of it, and just to understand what those differences are. Quick example, for women candidates are seeing a man enters a race and he is presumed qualified, take that one, and experienced. Women candidates constantly have to reinforce their experience. That's why in 2016 we said Hillary Clinton would be the most experienced candidate, blah, blah, blah. Because it's just a bias that we have about women versus men. We tend to think women aren't as good at math and science and the economy, so women have to really, and frankly, women candidates tend to, when we work with women candidates, evidence-based policies are really important because they have to show that they know the numbers, they know how it's going to work, they don't have as much leeway, if they want to be credible, to just kind of throw out big ideas without some real substance behind it.
Fantastic. You guys?
Great answer.
Good deal. Next question. Right here.
Hey there. I think there's this tendency, and it's maybe a good one, and particularly present in people in this room, to see evidence-based policy as this sort of panacea for all the ills and divides that are present in our country today. I guess one question I have is, science can maybe tell you the most efficient route from A to B, but it can't tell you if B or C is a more worthwhile place to go. And so, all the engineering on a plane to get me as quickly as possible to Europe is not all that helpful if my end goal is getting to Asia. Do you think there is this, I look at the wall behind you, what works to advance economic mobility? Is there a cohesive belief in this country that that is the end state towards which we want to drive? And do you think it's pervasive across the political spectrum?
Well, I guess I'd say we have to be honest. There are many problems that we face where we don't have much evidence of how we're going to overcome them. We have theories, we have good impulses, we have stuff we have to prove. But I think the important thing is don't make the opposite mistake, which is just assuming that if we do something sweeping, that it's going to work. We will always be a very practical country, and we can do enormous things if we put our minds to it and we're honest about it. And I think that is one of the next president is going to face the inequality challenge that we've been talking about, going to have to face up to climate change, which is a massive, very difficult problem to solve and to sustain. And the only way you're going to look at Franklin Roosevelt. Like, the reason that the New Deal survived is that he believed in the spirit of bold, persistent experimentation, where you go try things, you prove that they work, and when you show that they work, then the rest of the country will go along. But if you think you're smarter than the American people, or you think that there's one true faith that you can impose on people, you're more likely to set back the cause than advance it.
But I also think you have to be willing to make adjustments. Like, you may presume that one solution is going to work somewhere and it ends up it doesn't, so what adjustments are you going to make? We did a program when I worked at the New York City Board of Education, bring that in. So sorry to go back to Giuliani, but he started CopStat, which folks may remember, which was supposed to be evidence-based and taking in all kinds of statistics about crime and demographics. So we developed a system that could do that with all the inputs around the schools, because you have 1.1 million children. So trying to look at language and socioeconomics and grades and sort of try to figure out, okay, well, what is this principal doing in this school over here with the same demographic of kids, same situation over here? It's working here, it's not working there. Right. Can we move these ideas? Sometimes, yes. Sometimes there was another factor you couldn't have seen that said, no, that's not going to be quite the right fit there. So I think the point is, at least you have these ideas, we put them out there, and you do have to be willing to recognize it's not going to work everywhere, obviously, and you've got to account for a whole set of factors that you might not have considered in the beginning. But as Bruce said, you got to be willing to try, and I think people are pretty open to that if they see some results.
So I agree with everything you just said, but I actually think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, your question was, is economic mobility a good thing that we should all be aspiring to? Was that your question?
Well, is it something that we all actually aspire to? I mean,
okay.
We say we want to use evidence-based strategies to get there, but if people don't want that as an end state, it doesn't get us so far.
All right, good deal. Anybody going to advise a candidate to not be down with economic mobility?
Lewandowski, maybe? I don't know.
Okay, good deal. Did you want to get in on the ways that we get there?
Nope.
Last question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, this is Yan Li from Mississippi. So my question is, I remember back to February, and Bruce, you mentioned results are the best politics. So when we're really measuring results, and results is a function of different factors, and different people, they may have different parameters whenever they're looking at results on what works and what doesn't. So I'm just trying to see if you can share some of the challenges you have been seeing in the past, or the success you have been seeing in the past, about how to convening or to the field about, okay, this results of this program can be accepted by the majority.
That's a great question. Well, first, if people don't think that, if they don't share your view that there's a problem, then they're probably not going to be persuaded when you come along and prove that you've solved it. And sometimes, not everybody wins, and there's that. But I think the larger point is that if you want to do big things or small things with government or with society, you need to put your reputation on the line that you're going to prove it, be honest, and make adjustments, as Karen said, along the way. And you're never going to get 100% people bought in on the goal or the answer. But as I said before, we're a country that likes to solve problems, or at least, you know, that's what we think we are.
Yep.
Sometimes we're a country that causes problems, but we aspire to be a country that solves them, and we aspire to be a country that can come to agreement. And I think that the closer you get to Kevin's view of the higher levels of government, at the local level or state level, the more true that is, the more that pride overcomes partisanship.
And that's a great place for us to actually end the panel. You know, what you all are here in the room by definition because you're a part of wanting to solve the problems, to do it in the smartest possible way. What we've heard from the polls and what we've heard from the folks who were on the panel today is that Americans are actually hungry for those kind of solutions and hungry for us to get better and better at actually using things that actually work. I think we also heard that we're going to have to wait a minute before those kind of conversations start to happen on the national stage, but that the likelihood is that if we think that we want a different president than the one that exists today, for many people, the only way that's going to happen is that people can get to concrete solutions very quickly in what will be the latter parts of this race. I'm not used to talking on a political stage at all, so this was really interesting to me. I hope it was a little bit interesting to you. And I want to thank this panel, and please join me in doing so.
What's the point of doing